King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now we know from other inscriptions that they were having a feast in the city of Babylon on the night that Babylon fell. In fact, this is part of the reason why the city fell so quickly. They were in the citadel, or in the center of the city, having a feast, while the Persian army was actually coming up into the city from the canal of the river, the Euphrates River, which ran right through the city. So part of the reason why the city fell so easily is precisely because they were all the top guys were all sequestered away in this banquet hall having a feast. Belshazzar is probably having this feast in order to boost morale for his people, because they had recently, the army, the Babylonian army, had recently suffered some serious defeats at the hands of the Persians. They're not winning this war. There is a war going on between the Babylonians and the Persians are winning. Okay? And they know it. The people of Babylon know it. The Persians are winning this war. However, Babylon itself, the city of Babylon itself, was considered to be impregnable. They had their Euphrates River running right through the city, and they had these enormous walls. These, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar himself boasted in these walls in chapter 4 that were so large and so thick they were considered to be impossible to knock down. And they had enough food and water supply, of course, with the Euphrates River being in the city. They had enough supplies to last for years, to outlast a siege. And sieges always came down to who could last longer. When an army was besieging a city, the question of who was going to win always came down to who could last longer. The people inside the city or the army around it. Now you would think the people inside the city would be at a disadvantage, and of course they were at a disadvantage because they were the ones being besieged. But if they could outlast the army outside the city, because the army outside the city has to eat too. Alright? Not, the people inside the city have to eat, the people outside the city have to eat too. Now maybe they have freedom to move around and get food in a way that the people inside the city don't because they're cut off. But they have to get food too, and if they couldn't get enough food, or if they couldn't take the city before the weather changed and it got too cold, then they would have to leave. So, or until help came. If the city under siege has a neighboring city or an ally city that can send help, that can also make a difference. So, it always came down to who can last longer. So Babylon considered that they could last longer. It's like, not only was their city considered to be impenetrable, with defenses that could not be broken, even if another army decided to besiege the city, Babylon had enough resources to outlast that besieging army. So the war is not going well for Babylon. They are losing to the Persians, and they have just lost important battles to the Persians right before this. And Belshazzar is probably trying to boost his morale for himself and for his people by having this feast and reminding them that, hey, we're safe in the city. The Persians cannot take this city. Let's have a party. It's probably what's going on here. But this text doesn't say that. But we have other texts about the circumstances of the fall of Babylon that give us that indication. Or at least when you put them all together, they do. That's the impression I get. So King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, so he's drunk in other words, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, he might have taken more than that, he might have taken other goblets that he had taken. Nebuchadnezzar plundered temples, something he did. Nebuchadnezzar himself apparently had enough sense in his head not to ever actually use these things. He just had them. He had them in his treasury somewhere. But apparently Nebuchadnezzar, and his successors too, because Belshazzar is not his immediate successor. There were other people who came along the way. Apparently they had enough sense never to actually use these things. But this guy, and even this guy apparently didn't do this until he was drunk one night. At any rate, the line has been crossed now. The taboo has been violated. It's bad enough to have them in his possession, Now he's actually going to be using them and defining them by using them improperly. So that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. We read about that at the beginning of chapter 1. And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them, as they drank the wine. So they're taking the holy and making it unholy. This is just a goblet, okay? So these are just items. But we talked about when we read Leviticus that these items, they were items. They weren't people, okay? They were just items. But they had been set apart for a special use. That makes them holy. That's what holy is. That's what being consecrated means, be set apart for a special use. And these utensils that they use in their temple worship, their tabernacle and temple worship, were designed to help teach that point. Even though these may have only been utensils, the fact was they had still been set apart for special use, and therefore they were not to be handled as though they were common things. Even in the tabernacle days, when they still moved the tabernacle around from place to place, they couldn't even touch them directly. They had the priests had to wrap them up in cloth, and then the rest of the Levites could carry them when they were wrapped in the cloth. The Levites themselves couldn't even touch the things directly. And the point was to be made that these things, even though they're just things, they're just utensils, they're just items, have still been consecrated, sanctified, set apart for special use by God, and they were to be considered holy, and they were to be treated as holy. They were to be treated as different from the rest, and they were not to be treated like they were common. And so here, Belshazzar and his buddies are just treating these like just any other goblet, any other drinking glass. He's crossed the line here. I don't know what else Belshazzar did. This is the only story we have of him in the scriptures. He's barely mentioned in the historical event. He's so far pushed into the ground that when the Greeks got into Persia 100 years later, they had already stopped talking about him. The Greeks didn't know anything about Belshazzar because by the time they got there, the Persians had already buried him, buried his memory. He was apparently not a very good guy. The indication we get here is that he didn't measure up to the kingdom that God put him over, and he was thrown out because of that. And so it seems like Belshazzar is a buffoon, at least, at best, maybe a buffoon. And maybe even worse. We don't really know. But whatever he had done in his conduct as king of Babylon before this is the line that he has now crossed, the point of no return that he has now stepped over. We had plenty of stories of Nebuchadnezzar before he finally got to his point, and he ended up stepping back. He ended up saying, okay, God, you're right and I'm wrong. You're the Most High and I am not. Nebuchadnezzar got to that point eventually. Belshazzar clearly never did. We read about Nebuchadnezzar getting to that point. I don't know enough about Belshazzar to say what he was like before this, except to say that he apparently was not the right guy. But whatever he had done in his days before Daniel 5, this is the incident that pushes him over the line. So as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. We know the walls had plaster on them because when they excavated the city, they found plaster. We know they had lampstands because when they found the city, they found spots for lampstands. In fact, there was even a recessed area along the wall, which is quite likely where the king was sitting when this happened, the king's little area. They didn't find the inscription itself. That would have been a bit too much, I think. But they did find the plaster and the lampstand. Well, a lampstand at least. Near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand, so some ghostly, disembodied hand writing on the wall, as it wrote. That would be freaky. You just think about it. You're thinking about this large banquet hall. This is probably happening at night. And it's only lit by candles, okay? So there probably isn't great lighting anyway. Just near this writing is showing up near the lampstand, which is probably the most illuminated spot in the entire room. So you had this large banquet hall with all these nobles, all these drunk men and women, who are there partying, trying to convince them. They're basically trying to drink away their sorrows. Like I said, they're losing the war against Persia, but they're holed up in their city, and they think that their city is impregnable. They think they're going to be fine. Things may be turning to chaos outside the city, but as long as they're in Babylon itself, they're going to be okay. So they're essentially trying to drink away their troubles. And it's probably taking place at night. There's probably only the lighting in the room is probably poor. It's probably only lit by candlelight, and this spot in the room, probably near the king's own table, is probably the most well-lit spot in the room, and it's exactly where this ghostly disembodied hand shows up and starts writing on the wall. That's pretty freaky. I get freaked out just thinking about that. Like that's pretty spooky. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, or his complexion, the brightness went out from him, is what it says in the Hebrew or Aramaic, or that's the expression here. The brightness went out from him. His face turned pale. He lost his color, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. I had never been frightened like this. I had never been so scared that I lost strength in my legs. But I have been so worn out physically that I had a hard time standing. Not really because of fright, but because of physical exertion. The king called for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Now, for a long time, we didn't know what he meant when he said third highest ruler. Now we know, because he was the second. Adonias, his father, was the top dog, and he was somewhere else at the time. So he was number one. Belshazzar himself was number two. So the highest position he could offer was number three. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. I don't know why they couldn't read the writing. I'm not really clear on that. It seems to have been just regular words. And when Daniel reads it later, he's just going to read regular words that were in their language. So I'm not clear on why the language itself is incomprehensible to these men. It may have been written in a form they weren't familiar with. There were different kinds of written languages. You had the cuneiform languages, and you had the hieroglyphic languages, and you had the written languages. So it could have been written in a language that was not the one they were familiar with. I don't really know. It could have not, it's possible it didn't have vowels. Vowels were a relatively late addition to human alphabets. Even today, when you go around, you go to a parking lot, for example, you look at the license plates. And if you see license plates where people tried to write words or a message, chances are they're going to leave out the vowels. We still leave out the vowels whenever we write words if we have to. And they did, like I said, and vowels were a relatively late addition to human alphabets. So it could be that it was written without vowels and they didn't know what the words were. The words have double meanings, as we're going to read down here. These words have double meanings, so it could be they didn't know what the double meanings were. I just don't know. I don't really know why they couldn't read the words. They don't seem to have been like some divine language that no human's ever seen before. But I don't really know why they couldn't read the words. So they could not read the writing and tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, now this would be the queen mother. This is not the wife of the king, or one of the wives of the king, or even his favorite wife. This would be his mother. The queen mother was the most powerful position a woman could have in these kingdoms back in those days. Simply being the wife of a king didn't mean much, because the king had multiple wives, he had multiple concubines. So if you were the wife of the king, you were just one of many. You may have been his favorite wife, but even that, you could lose your status as his favorite wife in a day if he felt like it. If you were his mother, though, he can only have one of you. He can only have one mother. He could have more than one wife. He could have more than one favorite wife. He can only have one mother. So the position, if you're a woman in this culture, in this day and time, the position you're looking for is not to be the wife of the king, but to be the mother of the king. And that's who this is. This was probably the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. We don't really know this for certain. But this woman, whoever she is probably Nebuchadnezzar's daughter and Belshazzar's mother. So Belshazzar is probably the guy who's actually in charge right now is Nabonidus, and he is not a physical descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. I talked about that earlier. He went from Nebuchadnezzar to his son Evil-Merodach, and he got replaced after a couple of years, to Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law Nebuchadnezzar, and he got replaced, and then there was a coup, and there was an usurpation, and Nabonidus ends up with the kingdom around 556 BC or so. And he is an usurper. He is in a group of conspirators who took over the kingdom. And he is not a physical descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. But he probably did, in fact, marry a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar in order to strengthen his claim to the throne. And this woman is probably Belshazzar's mother. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. Excuse me. In the time of your father," that's Nebuchadnezzar, "he was found." Now, Nebuchadnezzar is not Belshazzar's actual literal father. Okay? He may be his grandfather, but we have to remember that this term father doesn't necessarily mean the man who actually put the semen in the woman that led to you. Okay, like that's how we take that to mean. But these ancient languages, those words for fathers are a lot more flexible than that. That word could mean father, grandfather, could mean predecessor. It's not as strict in its meaning of literally, this is a man whose semen led to your creation, in a way that our word father now means. This may have been legitimately his grandson, but even if it wasn't, Nebuchadnezzar was his predecessor. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods." Now, this would have been a while ago. Okay, this was 539 BC when this was happening. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. So Nebuchadnezzar has been dead for 23 years at this point. Daniel is still alive, as we find out here, but he'd be in his 80s at this point, easily in his 80s at this point. Maybe older, but at least in his early 80s at this point. There have been a number of change of rulers since the death of Nebuchadnezzar, a lot of turnover in the administration, and it's probable that in the turnover and in the palace coups and all that, Daniel was either he willingly retired and kind of went off into the distance, or he was forgotten or shunted aside or whatever. At any rate, he's kind of in the periphery now. He's not in the forefront like he had been. Because Nebuchadnezzar's been dead for 23 years. And there's been a number of guys come and go since then who've struggled for the throne. "King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." Daniel undoubtedly did a lot more than what we read about him in the book of Daniel. His career spanned practically all of Nebuchadnezzar's kingship and even beyond. So if Daniel had wanted to, he could have written a lot more than just these 12 chapters he gave us.